Welcome to the GMATstudy podcast. You're here because you believe there's a better way to study for the GMAT, and so do I. I created the GMATstudy to maximize your results and minimize your efforts so you can get to the fun parts about business school and life as quickly as possible. My name is Isaac Puglia, and I've been teaching GMAT classes and tutoring privately for the GMAT for over 6 years, and I personally have achieved a 99th percentile score on an official GMAT exam and helped hundreds of students get into the business schools of their choice. I'm excited to be a part of your MBA journey since I think the world can benefit from the best possible business leaders that we can find. And if this show is bringing you value, please share it with your friends and family who are studying for the GMAT so that together we can make this process as easy and painless for as many people as we possibly can. Let's go. Today, I want to talk about how to manage the variables in your life outside of your GMAT studies in order to optimize your studies. This is a big topic, perhaps obviously. What I'm going to do is do my best to be very tactical with you and give you some actionable items that will actually move you forward in these situations. I probably won't be able to cover every single element that can come up outside your GMAT studies, but I've done my best to be as comprehensive as possible. Right before we get into this, I just want to mention that today is January 31st, 2020, and on February 4th, in just a few days, the price to register for the GMAT exam is going to increase, at least in the United States and Canada. There may be other places that it is increasing. Feel free to jump online on MBA.com and verify that. It is going from $250 to $275. It's not a tremendous leap percentage-wise. It's a 10% increase. The price has not changed, to my knowledge, in the last 15 years. That's not to say that the price increase is justified, and it's certainly not to say that I don't think the exam is already much more expensive than it should be to take, but I also don't work at GMAC, and I do not know what type of costs they're dealing with. But if anyone from GMAC is listening, if you could bring down the price, that would be amazing. Right now, it seems like you can't, and you're doing your best. So the reason I'm bringing that up is if you plan to register for the GMAT soon, if you do it within the next few days, that could save you $25. So that's a little bit of extra motivation to get your test date scheduled if it's already on your plate. So let's talk about managing outside variables. This has come up a lot for me in working with people, and it came up very recently, and that's what inspired me to talk to you about this today. I was talking to a student about practice test scores, and a lot of times people come in and they're gunning for really, really high scores, and they're studying hard, and they know the material, and they're doing a reasonable job of implementing a lot of the tactics that I teach around tracking their questions they're missing that they know how to do, et cetera, things that I mentioned in the early episodes of this podcast if you've been listening. But it often comes out through talking to them and digging deeper when their score does go down that they're doing a poor job managing the outside of GMAT variables in their life, such as important relationships, sleep, exercise, things that can have a pretty major impact on us when we sit down to take a GMAT that we're not always thinking about consciously, even though it might be obvious in retrospect that those things matter. For example, when people take practice tests after a full day of work, that often means their score does not represent their actual abilities because they're tired. And chances are you're not going to take the official exam after a full day of work, so practicing that way is kind of unrealistic. And that's really what I want to talk about here, because you're going to be very, very frustrated if your ambition is at the 770 level, but the actual actions you're taking and your effort you're putting in is at the 650 level. That's a recipe for suffering and frustration. You really want to make sure that the actual actions you're taking, not just the plan you're making, but the actual actions you're taking on a day in, day out basis are lining up with the ambition of where you want to end up eventually. That's how you get peace of mind at the end of the day. To give you an example of just making sure that you're putting the energy into this, Michael Jordan, a hero of mine who's a great basketball player, arguably the greatest of all time, and if you're not familiar with him, and before the basketball season, professional season would start, he would shut down basically everything in his life for weeks on end before the season began. He wouldn't do any endorsements, he wouldn't do any commercials, he wouldn't do any major business deals. He would just train, play golf for recreation, and sleep. and that was it. That was his whole life. And so by the time the season started, he was so far ahead of his competition, who were sort of just playing around in those final weeks before the season and then waiting for the season to start getting in shape and training themselves and getting their mind right. So I want you to set yourself up for success as well, because I think this stuff makes a tremendous difference in terms of how long you'll have to study, how much you'll have to study, and the ultimate result that you're going to get when it comes down to taking the exam. So let's get into it. The first thing that you want to think about managing is managing stress. Now, stress is almost certainly going to just be part of the deal when you're studying for the GMAT. So it's not that we want to eliminate stress. It's not that we even want to minimize stress. It's that we want to set ourselves up to manage the stress that we are likely to face very well. So a couple points that I think can help. The first is, if you don't already do this on a regular basis, make sure that you schedule every single day of your life, either the night before or, if you need to, the Sunday night before the beginning week or whatever. Pick a day of the week where you have time to sit down and strategize about your week ahead and plan out how you're going to fit all your commitments in, because chances are, if you're beginning to study for the GMAT, you are adding a new commitment to your life, and that will often necessitate rebalancing your existing commitments. So, a couple pieces of advice here. Write down all the commitments that you have in a certain day or a certain week and rank them in importance. Or you may already know what those important things are. But if you haven't taken the time to do this exercise, do it at least once. You don't have to do it every single day, but do it at least once. Sit down for 10 minutes. It might not even take you that long. And just write down all your major commitments, like family obligations, work obligations. You don't have to get too specific, but just make sure that you have a very conscious hierarchy in your mind of what is the most important stuff to you, and make sure you schedule the most important things at the beginning of your day. So for example, if health is your number one priority, make sure you get up early enough to know what your meals are going to be like for that day, what you're intaking in terms of food, and how you're going to be exercising and taking care of your body that day, if at all. If family is the most important thing, then make sure you prioritize making an important phone call or just setting up an important get-together or personal time at the beginning of the day, so that that's not hanging over you while you're going through these less important activities that most of us have to go through on a day-to-day basis. Most of us are not just dealing with the absolute highest priority of our life 24/7. There are certain things that we deal with that are lower priority, and it's best to do those after you've taken care of the important stuff. It really will reduce your mental drag and therefore likely your stress. Once you get the most important stuff done in the day, like if studying is really important for you, then make sure you schedule some study time at the beginning of the day. But if work is the most important thing in your life, then make sure that you get a good performance out of yourself at your job in the early time of the day, and then you study later at night. Just make sure you know what your priorities are, because again, just making sure that that stuff is clearly defined in your mind and clearly reflected in how you're actually acting throughout the day, how you're showing up, it's going to make everything else so much easier. Step 2 is making sure you communicate with the important people in your life. This is something that we don't often associate with stress unless you have a lot of really stressful relationships. But I think you can mitigate a lot of the potential stress in your life by having some conversations up front. So what you want to ask is, how is studying for the GMAT going to be impacting your important relationships? Are there certain people in your life who are willing to support you or desiring to support you? And are there folks in your life who might be antagonistic toward your studies, and you might want to either write down a list or just get clear in your heart and your mind as to who is who? And if they want to support you, then make sure you communicate with them and let them know exactly how they can be supportive for you. Most folks who want to give to us in our lives are not psychic. Many people are very good at intuiting our needs, but what you want to avoid is people wanting to give to you, but then taking away by giving something that they think they would want, but you don't actually want. And you can reduce a lot of the potential stress of those situations by just communicating honestly up front. Hey, do you want to support me in my GMAT studies? Or, hey, I know you want to be supportive in this process. Here's what would be most supportive for me, for you to do. How would that be for you? And make a request. And then think about or ask how you can give back to have some reciprocity in the situation, because most relationships are based on reciprocity. And if everyone feels like everyone is winning, you're going to get better results in most situations. This also includes bosses, coworkers, clients, friends, partners, and people you live with, especially if you plan to be studying at home. Talk to people about what your plan is for studying, how much and how little you're going to be studying. I touched on this a little bit in the first episode of this podcast, I believe. If you haven't listened to that, that's well worth listening to. It might be worth a re-listen, actually, if you haven't listened to it in a while. But going a little bit into more detail here, work out how the needs of everybody will be prioritized in key situations if there's conflict. So for example, at work, if you have a really important project that's extremely important to your boss, is that going to trump your GMAT studies, or are your GMAT studies more important than those types of key projects? Now, that's a conversation you might have to have with yourself first and then make a presentation to people you work with. But you want to be clear for yourself, and you want to work that out in advance with the person if that's appropriate. And if it's not appropriate, just work it out for yourself so that you know, hey, if something comes up at work, I'm going to have to reschedule my study plans for the week. Or if something comes up at work, I need to prepare for what I'm going to say and the reasons that I'm going to give that are going to be compelling as to why I can't take more on at work because I am studying. So if you can be transparent with the people around you about why you're doing this, I think that that is the best possible situation. But I also recognize there may be situations where that transparency is going to work against you, and you should figure out in advance and plan for how you're going to deal with situations if they do come up and they conflict with your goals. If you agree to a battle plan for these types of situations, then when things do sort of get into tension and conflict, it's going to be so much easier to A, make good decisions that are going to support everyone involved, and B, avoid the emotional fallout that usually just takes way more time and energy to then resolve that emotional fallout after the fact. This is particularly true with people you live with, friends, and romantic partners who are just very emotionally intertwined most of the time with our lives. Now, it may be uncomfortable to approach this stuff at the beginning, but people will really appreciate it. They'll appreciate the fact that you considered them and their perspective in making your own plans, and that's much more likely to make them want to be supportive. Now, not everybody has that reciprocal type of personality. Some people are extremely selfish, and if you're dealing with those types of people in your life, then you need to think about how you're going to manage that type of situation. Again, if they're antagonistic toward helping you move forward, that's not nice, but most of us are going to deal with some people like that in the situation, and it's best to, once again, just plan for that. Third thing you can do to really minimize the stress or just help you manage stress that's likely going to come up is make sure you put together a routine that you know you can stick to. And I want to be really intentional about this. You don't want to put together your ideal routine or a routine that you want to be true. You want to put together a routine that you know you can and will fulfill on, especially when things get hard. And you want to schedule in time and flexibility in your routine so that if things go wrong, it doesn't throw you off very much. And I'm going to talk about that a little bit more in a moment. But for now, I want you to put together a realistic routine. What can you definitely commit to, even in a difficult week where you have difficult things happening in your personal life, difficult things at work? How is this routine going to adapt, or how is this routine going to stay consistent even when it gets stress tested? Because it's tempting to sit down and just say like, well, in a perfect world, I would do X, Y, and Z. That's fun. I do that, actually. I like to allow myself to dream, and then I try to pull that stuff into the most realistic, practical plans that I can. And I'm a big believer in that type of thinking and brainstorming and planning of life. And I'm personally definitely an optimist. But I've noticed that for myself and for many of my students, that can sometimes get us in trouble because we'll often overcommit to things and think like, oh yeah, I'll be able to spend 3 hours with this person and then immediately transition to studying. That's not always actually easy to do, especially if you have a lot of other human beings involved in your life. Human beings aren't like machines. They don't just turn off and turn on, and certain conversations you just can't always walk away from productively. So you want to commit to a routine that will be able to be stress tested. And I think I made my point on that. So let's move on. It's so much easier to keep doing what you've been doing versus making a change. There's a lot of energy that goes into making changes. And so if you get into a solid routine with your GMAT studies from the beginning, 3 or 4 weeks from now, it's going to take so much less willpower to just continue that routine versus at the very beginning when you have to reprioritize and make changes. So you want to isolate the difficulty of that early on in your studies, where your motivation and your inspiration usually is often the highest. That's the time to make changes in your routine, so that down the line, you're not having to expend extra willpower on a day-to-day basis, improvising, replanning, and restructuring your routine. Now, some of that might have to happen, and that's okay. You just want to embrace that as part of the cost of achieving your dreams. Now, when you get into a rhythm, that really helps make it easy to sit down for a study a session that's an hour, let's say, because you do that every day. You studied from 6 to 7 p.m. for the last 3 days. It's so much easier to keep studying from 6 to 7 p.m. for the next 5 days, or whatever your schedule winds up being. So this includes things like standardizing or just planning for the time of day you're going to study, what time of day and what area of your life or what days of the week are going to provide the most consistency, because consistency of your studies is probably the main factor in your success. And this also includes things like locations, so that you don't need to be thinking about where you're going to study today. Ideally, you find a place that's comfortable for you and that allows you to minimize distractions. Some people like to study at the office, some people like to study at home, some people like to go to a cafe. And I think you want that physical location where you're studying to plug into your daily routine, so you're not having to go very far out of your way just to get there. So for example, if work is very stressful for you, it's a good idea to leave work before you start your studies, but probably head to a cafe or some type of neutral co-working space that's on the way home from your office, or not too far out of the way from your office or wherever your place of business is, back to where your home is. Because usually when we get home, the relaxation response kicks in from the day and it's kind of time to wind down, maybe eat food, socialize, that kind of thing. And it makes it harder if you are getting into that zone and then you're pulling yourself out of that zone to now get back into the study mode. I found for most people it's good to sort of remain partially in the working frame of mind, knock out the study, and then that's not hanging over you when you get home and you can just truly focus on relaxing, which we'll get to in a moment. And again, if you do that same thing, study in that same place on a regular basis, there's no extra willpower involved in making that decision. It's just natural for you to go from work to the cafe where you study, put in a solid 60 to 90 minutes or whatever you're going to do, and then you head home. Now, moving away from stress and talking about some other elements that are difficult to manage but important is deciding which pleasurable activities are going to support your studies best and which could potentially undermine your studies. And I think what you want to do is just make an emotional commitment to yourself that for the next probably 3 to 6 months while you're studying for the GMAT, you might have a different timeline, but for the next 3 to 6 months, how are you going to engage in the harmful ones either only on special occasions or as celebrations? Because it's not always realistic to just completely eliminate a habit that could undermine your studies, but how are you going to manage those habits the best that you possibly can? What days of the week are you going to be able to relax and hang out with friends or take time away from studying? And what days of the week are you going to commit to being as focused as possible? So this includes things like sacrificing sleep. If you're on a strange work schedule, for example, if you work in international time zones and you're often up late the night before and up early the next morning for a meeting or something like that, you want to plan your studies around that. So if you're always tired on Tuesdays and there's not a whole lot that you can do to rearrange your client schedules to reduce that drag on yourself, then Tuesdays would be a great day to take off from studying and plan to study a little bit more the other 5 or 6 days of the week that you plan to study. Things like heavy drinking or other substance abuse. Now, this is a complicated topic. I'm not going to get too deep into this, but this is your life and these are your choices. So I'm not going to tell you how to be you, but most of us are going to be a lot less effective mentally after a night of heavy drinking versus not. Now, you get to decide what's heavy drinking for you. It's totally fine to have a glass of wine or maybe even a couple on a Friday night, especially if you're going to take that night off or something, but you don't want to expect to put down a couple bottles of wine on Friday night and then be at your best and ready to crush a practice GMAT on Saturday morning. That's just being unrealistic, and again, that's setting you up for failure and stress. Again, you want to make sure that the way you're taking action, not just in your studies, but in other areas of your life, the way you're managing the other areas of your life aligns with how ambitious you are with your GMAT score. So again, these are your choices. This is your life. I just want you to start thinking, what are the activities that I'm engaging in that are going to support my studies? How do I maximize those? And what are the activities that could potentially undermine my studies? And how do I minimize the effect that those have on my studies, even if I am going to choose to engage in those things? For example, if you really like to party and that's a big part of your life and a big way that you relieve stress, no judgment, absolutely no judgment, nothing but respect for that. What you want to do is say, okay, if I'm going to go out on Friday night, which is the best night of the week for me to go out, then I'm not going to plan to get a lot done on the GMAT front on Saturday morning. Instead, I'm going to do laundry and clean my house on Saturday mornings, even though that's a little painful, and then maybe take a nap in the middle of the day on Saturday, and then plan to study a little bit in the evening, and then go out for a lighter night on Saturday nights, something like that. You don't have to give up your entire life to study for the GMAT. You just want to be smart about how you plan this stuff and not just be winging it as you go, which is a real mistake that I think a lot of people make. So another important question that's optional here is just think about what you're willing to give up to have this. Are you willing to give up some socializing? Are you willing to, or is that a non-negotiable for you? Are you willing to give up a little bit of restful time or other hobbies or activities that you would like to do? What is the priority? That's what I was talking about at the top of the episode. Just make sure you make your list and make sure your actions line up with what's most important. Now, an important thing to mention here is everybody makes mistakes with this stuff. We're all human beings. We get distracted. Our decisions are generally not entirely rational. Sometimes we make very emotionally motivated decisions or just totally irrational decisions for no reason. And everybody slips. Everybody gets off track. What separates people who are really successful, in my opinion, is how quickly they realize they're off track and how quickly they're able to get back on track and refocus once they notice that they're off track, instead of letting several hours or several days go by and then realizing, oh shoot, I'm way off track and now I have to recalibrate. So just practice. You don't need to expect to be great at this at the beginning. If you fall off for a few days, just make your goal, once you get back on track, the next time you fall off, to notice one day earlier, so that the next time you slip, it's only 2 days, and the next time you slip, it's only 1 day. Or if you fall off for a day, think about how am I going to get back on track in just a matter of hours next time, and just be willing to not be great at managing this stuff at the beginning, but to improve at managing these variables over time, because we need the right balance of compassion for ourselves and also being hard enough on ourselves that we actually change and make progress, and that we're not just letting ourselves off the hook and allowing ourselves to sleep through an opportunity to make our dreams come true. Which brings us to the topic of sleep. This is extremely important. You've heard me mention it many times if you've been engaging with the podcast for a while. Here's my advice on sleep. Number one, schedule your sleep time. Schedule it and stick to it. Manage these variables. What's realistic in terms of your sleep needs and your capacity to get enough sleep? So again, it's all about just being honest with yourself. What's going to help you truly be optimized, and how can you balance that? We're looking for a peak performance here. So what amount of sleep is going to allow you to perform at your best while not encroaching on the other areas of your life? For example, for me personally, I'm probably going to be more effective on 10 hours of sleep than I'm going to be on 7 or 8. However, the net gain from 8 hours to 10 hours is not worth the things I give up in the day, and so I don't sleep 10 hours every night. Now, sleeping something like 4 hours is going to hamper my capacity the next day so much more that it's not worth getting those extra 2 or 3 or 4 hours of productive time back in the day. It's much more worth it for me personally to sleep usually 5, 6, 7, 8 hours is kind of where my range is, depending on the day. And this is totally optional, but I'll just do this as an aside. I generally sleep without an alarm. Now, not everybody can afford to do that, but I just try to go to bed early enough and manage my life well enough that I can allow my body to just wake up naturally. Some people are going to be able to do that. Some people aren't. And if you're interested in doing something like that, it usually takes about a month to recalibrate, where you get caught up on your sleep debt and then you start waking up at a normal time. This, again, is totally optional. I don't want to get too much into what I do and what works for me, because this podcast is about what's going to work for you. But I just want to give you an example of how to prioritize sleep, because you need to have an honest conversation with yourself. Like, maybe you want 8 hours, but you can get by on 7, and that extra hour of the day is going to help you nourish an important relationship in your life, which then makes it easier for you to study. Now, if you get in there and you start sleeping 7 hours and you realize I'm too tired to study, well, then you're going to have to make some sacrifices and sleep 8. For example, I would love to sleep less. I would love to need less sleep, but I sacrifice other things in my life that I would like to be doing, like reading more, hanging out, socializing a lot of times is what takes the hit for me in my life. Not 100%, but I would love to socialize more, things like that. But I sleep a little bit more because I know that that touches every single area of life. My health, my energy, my mood, my productivity, my relationships that I do engage in. It's much better for me to spend an hour hanging out with someone when I'm in a good mood than it is to spend 3 hours hanging out with them when I'm really just super fatigued and tired and they're kind of carrying the whole, load of the interaction, right? And enjoyment is part of this as well. We want to try to enjoy studying for the GMAT as much as we can because enjoyment is a form of energy that can really help you stay motivated and stay focused. And ideally, this is something you're doing because this is your passion and this is your dream that you're chasing. And so you want to try to bring as much of that energy into your studies and managing these other areas of your life as you can. And the reason I'm talking about this is sleep tends to be a sensitive issue for a lot of people. Now, it takes a lot of extra willpower to stay focused when you're tired. So again, you might have to experiment with this and just find that sweet spot where you think, okay, I can get by on this, perform very well, and still get a lot of good takeaways from my study sessions. Maybe I wish I could study 3 hours a day, but what's more practical is I can't get by on 6 hours of sleep, so I have to get 7.5, and I'm just going to get a good 90 minutes in every day, even if that means studying for an extra month or something to take the GMAT. I promise you will get to your goal faster if you focus on effective study hours rather than just lots and lots of hours where you're very tired. That brings us to another controversial and difficult subject to broach, which is diet, the food intake that you're engaging with. So this is very controversial. It's often the hardest thing to change when it comes to making personal change. So I'm going to put a lot of this on you, but I will give you a few recommendations. So you should figure out what's best for you and just be as consistent as you possibly can and be nice to yourself when it comes to dieting while you're taking the GMAT, because studying for the GMAT takes a lot of willpower. It's going to take a lot of emotional energy, especially when things aren't going well, to keep your focus and just stay in the game. And you don't want to be undercutting yourself on the base level of basically just the chemical makeup of our body by messing with your diet too much. And the same goes for sleep, frankly. Now, a couple recommendations here. I would recommend avoiding low carbohydrate diets unless you're already in a great mental state with a low carbohydrate diet and you've optimized your body for that, such as a ketogenic diet, which is very popular right now, where your brain basically is trained to run on a different fuel source than what its default fuel source is, arguably, which is sugar. Basically, your brain runs on glucose, which are simple sugars. Now, that's not an excuse to go crazy eating a lot of refined sugar. It's just that the carbohydrates that you intake, like bread and grains and fruits, in a lot of cases, that gets converted into simple sugars in your body without going too much into detail with that. And your brain uses that as fuel. And your brain is one of the most nutrient consuming organs in your body, and that's compounded when you're studying, because when you're studying and learning, challenging yourself, you're taxing your brain very heavily. Most of us also work in jobs that are pretty mentally and sometimes emotionally intensive, and so we have to factor that in as well. So I don't recommend being on a low carbohydrate diet. If you're trying to lose body fat or change your body composition, you might just want to wait to go heavily into that until after you're done studying for your GMAT. Okay, more on that in a second. Now, another tip I can give that's simple but powerful is if there's something that you do feel bad about eating, or maybe you feel guilty, just try to eat a little bit less of that. Just a little bit less, just one bite less, and try to grow with that over time, or even one portion less, or just take a day of the week where you think, okay, I'm not going to eat that one thing that I know is not necessarily supporting my health. And then on top of that, or if you cannot do that, which I respect, just pick something that you know will make you feel better, that is healthy for you, and start eating a little bit more of that. Because I've been very struck in handling my own dietary issues and talking to many, many people about this, that even just adding a little bit of good stuff in can make a profound difference in your energy level and your mood, even if you don't end up eliminating a lot of the bad stuff. And on the same side of that coin, if you just eliminate one thing that's bad, you don't have to cut out everything that you know you shouldn't be eating, or that you feel guilty about eating, or that you know is undermining your studies. Even just a little bit less of the bad stuff and a little bit more of the good stuff can make a really, really big difference when it's compounded over time. Okay, so again, be nice to yourself. Don't be too cruel to yourself. Don't be too hard on yourself, but make a change for the better so that you're better tomorrow than you were today, and that your studies are more optimized tomorrow than they were today, ideally. That brings us to an important point. I sort of touched on this, but I think it's worth touching on again. I don't recommend trying to lose weight while you're studying for the GMAT, because that usually necessitates being in a caloric deficit, burning more calories than you're consuming, and that's going to put extra stress on your body and brain and make things more difficult when it comes to managing mood and the important variables of studying well. So I don't want to get too deep into this because, again, it's a massive topic, but if you just pop into a web search, how to calculate your maintenance calories, so that you know roughly how many calories you should be taking in on a day in, day out basis, so that you can hit that maintenance number, so that you're not working against your fitness goals if you do have strong fitness goals, but also that you're not dieting too heavily and making life harder for yourself. I'd also strongly recommend tracking your caloric intake and your macronutrients every day, but that also is a controversial and difficult thing to do, so I'm going to just make this an advanced technique. I would recommend just creating some awareness around what you eat and the type of nutrition that you're currently taking in, even if you don't want to do a lot of research on what optimal nutrition is, because frankly, that is a deep rabbit hole that you can go down. There's many, many opinions about what we should be eating to optimize. But at the end of the day, you should do something that feels good to you, that you can sustain. That's really key, especially when you're studying for the GMAT. If you want to make major dietary changes after you're done studying, I'm totally fine with that. But I think while you're studying, you want to stick to what you think and know works for you and not make too many big changes. Now, a couple things that can help you with this are apps like MyFitnessPal is a good one that's both web-based and mobile phone-based. And another one that I've started using recently that I really like is called Chronometer. I don't know how it's properly pronounced, but it's Chronometer. And I think it's just chronometer.com. But that one I like because it shows you all your micronutrients, how many, what your vitamin intake is like from the foods that you're eating. It's a little bit harder to input foods, so I usually just do that once a week, and I try to get a gauge for on a day in, day out basis. Am I hitting my caloric needs and my micronutrient needs? Things like vitamin A and vitamin K and things that are just we don't always think about. And I don't really do that every single day. I think that for me personally, that's overkill, but I do track my caloric intake and outtake every single day, and I know what my macronutrients are. I know how much protein, fat, and carbohydrates I'm taking in, but that's something I've been doing for years, so I'm in a routine with that. Now, if that's going to distract you from your studies, if that's just too much, if it's overwhelming, don't worry about it. But if you're curious, I would definitely recommend getting into tracking that stuff because I've found it very enlightening and very helpful. But again, that's more of an advanced tactic. Now, that kind of stuff, making dietary changes, can be hard, and I think it's important to just address that really quickly and give you a tactic that I think might be helpful. So if you're going to try to be your best at anything, that usually takes quite a bit of effort because most of us aren't just naturally at our best, at our resting state. We have some things that serve our vision and our goals and our dreams for ourselves and the way we want to look, the way we want our life to look, that just happen naturally for us. And then we have certain habits and certain natural tendencies that kind of take us away from that, and it can be kind of a battle when you're trying to get to the next level in your life and you have to give up some of those negative habits. So one thing I can recommend that I've had a lot of success with recently is a reframing journal. And what I do in this journal every day is I pick something that's been bothering me in my life, either a difficult relationship or a difficult situation or a stressful way of thinking about things. And I just try to reframe it mentally as something more positive. Now, it doesn't always work. I'm not perfect with it, but it helps. It really, really helps. So in the case of something like tracking your food or maybe making a dietary change, in your reframe journal, I just have a note on my phone where I put that every day, and I have a reminder that pops up for me to do it every day, so I don't have to think about it. It just happens very naturally. It's part of my routine, as I've been talking about. And I might write in there, tracking my food is going to be hard, but I'm actually excited about doing this hard thing, even though I have some resistance to it, because I know that it's going to make it easier for me to get into business school. And then once I finish with the GMAT and I want to get to the next level of my fitness goals, I'm going to have this process already automatic for myself. So even though it's a challenge, even though it's something that might not be exciting naturally, I can reframe the way I'm thinking about it to give myself a little bit more energy. Now, some of you are going to harmonize with that way of practicing mental jujitsu, if you will, and some of you won't, and that's fine. My job is just to give the best recommendations that I can, and your job is to experiment with them and figure out what works best for you and what doesn't. And I just want to say that the way you're thinking about a lot of this stuff, the way you're conceptualizing it, is going to have a big impact on your studies most of the time. So it's worth addressing those types of mental barriers, if you will. So that's one tactic there. This, of course, brings us to exercise, which is another important element to manage when you're studying for the GMAT. Now, I think personally it's very unwise to stop exercising to make more time to study. This kind of goes back to the sleep thing. There's a certain amount of sleep that you might be able to sacrifice that will help you, but then at a certain point you're just making things harder and working against yourself. So you need to figure out what's going to be best for you. You might have to cut back a little bit if you're really, really into fitness and you're spending hours and hours a day at the gym. And like I said, it's not, while you're studying for the GMAT, it's not a great time to be achieving other fitness goals like training for a triathlon or something like that. Now, I'm not going to tell you not to go for it. I'm all for achieving things and going big. And if you can manage it, more power to you, but it's probably going to make things harder, not easier, okay? And it's worth talking about that. Basically, every student that I've ever had who's planning a marriage while studying for the GMAT has had a horrible time making progress with their GMAT studies because there are just so many logistics to handle when you're planning to get married. So these are things to think about. Getting back to the exercise thing, I think you should plan to do it at least 3 days per week because regular exercise routine actually increases your cognitive function and is going to make you a more efficient learner. So it's much better to get 90 minutes of good study in plus 30 minutes of exercise that you enjoy or at least can tolerate than it is to just get 2 hours of studying in per day and then not exercise for 3 months. That's probably going to work against you. And you want to make sure that you don't fall into the trap of using the need to study as an excuse to stop exercising if you're not naturally into fitness but you have a good routine. Ideally, you don't change your exercise routine when you start studying for the GMAT, but if you have to shift it around, that's very, very common. And again, you might just want to scale back your fitness goals for the next few months as you study, and then you can scale those back up once you're done studying. Now, this is, again, a huge topic with exercise, but my advice is just pick something that you like, that you know you can be consistent with, and stick to it. Again, just make it a routine so there's not a lot of willpower when it comes to the time to exercise. It's just part of your day. You just show up at the gym at 6. You show up at the gym at 6 every day. Some days you have great workouts. Some days you have poor workouts, but you just do it. You show up. And on days where you're feeling better, you do a little bit more. On days where you're feeling worse, you do a little bit less. And there's actually plenty of research to support that when you're feeling better, if you do a little bit more exercise or exercise a little more intensely, and then on days where you're not feeling as good, you back off the intensity, that you'll actually make faster gains versus if you just push yourself to exactly the same intensity no matter how you're feeling. Now, plenty of people I'm sure will argue with me on that, and that's okay. I'm not here to give like fitness optimization advice, but I think you should figure out what works for you and again, make it part of your daily routine. That brings us to a very important topic, which is recovery. And this is especially important if we are going to be pushing ourselves physically and mentally, which we generally will be while we're studying. So recovery time is absolutely necessary. I think the physical exercise analogy is good here because let's take the example of lifting weights or maybe even running. You don't get stronger while you're training. You don't get stronger while you're lifting weights. While you're lifting weights, you're actually stressing yourself. It's making you weaker in a sense. You have less energy. And then the recovery time, sleep, and downtime is when you actually rebuild the muscle that you're going to use to engage in a heightened level of stress, aka you're stronger and you can challenge yourself more. And this is pretty similar to what we're doing with our brains when we're studying. We're stressing ourselves while we're learning, we're recovering, and then we have greater capacity the next time we sit down to study. So here are my 3 pieces of advice for recovery time. First is just figure out the right amount that you need. And again, be realistic. You might have to experiment with this. And then figure out the right activities that are the most productively restful for you, because not all different types of downtime are going to be productive rest. So if it's movies and TV, if it's times with friends, if it's books, if it's going shopping, whatever you like, and whatever generally makes you forget about the rest of your life for a little while, those are good activities to make sure that you put in your study schedule for the next 3 months. Don't sacrifice too much of those. So here's my advice. Second piece of advice is schedule that downtime in. Now that might be super painful for you folks who like to be a little more improvisational with your life. I think if you just schedule some unstructured time so that you know, okay, from 5 p.m. to 12 p.m., 12 a.m. on Fridays, I don't have to have a plan. I'm just free to do whatever I want to do in the moment. And then other times and other days of the week are more structured. That's fine. If you want to make sure that you make it to your softball league, make sure you schedule that in. If you want to make sure you have plenty of time to take your romantic partner out for dinner once a week or for something you like to do, then make sure you schedule that and make sure you have conversations with those people up front that you may not be able to spend as much time as you normally would, but that time is going to come back down the line. But here's the thing. The third piece of advice is you should think about recovery time as part of your preparation. Because if you're thinking that recovery time is working against your progress, then it's going to be much, much harder to prioritize it, and you're going to do probably too little of it. Instead, you want to think that when you're engaging with that recovery time, that's a lot of times when you're actually getting better. That's when you're integrating all the studying that you've been doing, and that if you get the right amount of recovery time in every single day and or every single week, that's actually going to accelerate your progress. So I like to count my recovery time as part of my working hours, part of my study time, if you will. I'm not currently studying for the GMAT, but I'm definitely pushing myself on a wide variety of fronts in terms of learning new information and increasing my skills. And I like to count my recovery time during the week as hours that I'm putting into those activities, because it's when I'm resting that I'm often integrating a lot of the input that I put in. And I think framing it like that, coming back to that idea of how you think about these things, can be extremely, extremely powerful. Now, the more you cheat your recovery time when you do need it, the more that can undermine you. So again, just have an honest conversation with yourself, figure out what the right balance is, and then make it a part of your routine every week so you don't have to think, ooh, when am I going to have, downtime this week? It's part of the schedule. You do it the same days or same times every week, or at least with somewhat consistency, some type of consistency so that it's not stressful. This brings us to very mundane things like day-to-day logistics, and this is things like laundry, grocery shopping, cleaning, administrative work in your life. You got to go to the DMV to get your license renewed, things like this. Again, this should be part of your schedule. So this is why it can sometimes be helpful to sit down on a Sunday night and plan the week ahead. Now, many of you are very, very high functioning adults, and so this is already integrated into your life. And maybe this whole entire episode is just horribly redundant for you. And as always, I really apologize if this isn't resonating or being helpful for you. But there are some people who you're just going to forget about this kind of stuff when you're making your schedule, and I want to make sure that it gets in there so that you're not caught by surprise at the end of the day. I don't want to spend too much time on this because everybody's going to have some different needs, but if you have to automate your grocery shopping by engaging with a delivery service or something like Amazon Prime Now or whatever they call that, to get your groceries delivered because you don't have that extra hour to go shopping during the week, even though you really like food shopping. Just figure out the right balance for you so that you can optimize the rest of your life. And again, that priority list that I talked about at the top of the episode can be very, very helpful. Where does laundry lie on the priority? Where does cleaning your apartment lie on the priority list? If you're living with other people, can they pick up a little bit of the slack that you normally would for a few months? Or can you somehow work out a deal with them to make that easier for you? You get the idea, okay? So just plan for it in advance. Now, whatever you do with this, just make sure you have a way to get it handled, because if you're just pushing this stuff off and not grocery shopping and not thinking about it, that can really, really work against you, because it's going to add a lot more stress, versus if all those things are taken care of and optimized, it's going to add a lot of energy to your study process. Just think of a simple example like having really high quality food at home versus having to go out for every single meal. Well, if you have high quality food at home that you like, that you enjoy, that can cut down on the amount of travel time that you need that's going to take away from your studies. Couple more things. I know this episode's long, but hopefully it's going to be worth it. Another thing to plan for is mistakes and unexpected things. Now, I kind of addressed this when I was talking about making your plan stress testable, but pretty much every week in adult life, if not more often, something's going to come up that you didn't plan for that's going to be difficult to handle. Things like getting sick or having an injury, extra work at your job, or maybe you get promoted at work unexpectedly at your job, or maybe you have some family stuff come up, personal stuff. You want to make sure there's some free time and some flexibility built into your schedule to handle those difficult situations as they arise. Next is make sure you schedule when you'll take practice exams, because practice exams are the most vulnerable type of studying you're going to do, and these are the most affected by your state of mind and your state of body when you take them. So make sure that you schedule time the night before you take a practice exam to get very good rest so that you're in a physically and cognitively optimized place. That doesn't mean not going out and having a good time. That could be the opposite, actually. Maybe you do go out and have a really nice time with some friends, take your mind off things so that you're relaxed and in a good space when you go to bed on Friday night, and so you're in a good space when you get up to take the test on Saturday. Again, just know yourself and do what works for you. You also want to make sure that you schedule a little bit of time the day of or the morning of the test to get in the zone. So get into a routine. You're going to want to have a good meal right before you take the test, or with enough time to digest before you start taking the test, so that you're not sucking a lot of energy away by digesting. These are things that you don't always think about that wind up making a big difference, because it's easy to make a mistake and eat too big of a meal right before you sit down to take the test. That can undermine you, take you a little longer to get in the zone. So schedule a little bit of time to do the things you like to do to get in the zone. If you really like making that cup of coffee for yourself before you sit down to take the exam, make sure you have time to do that. Now, I would also recommend developing a post-practice test routine, because practice tests can be very emotionally draining, psychologically draining, and most practice tests are not going to go up linearly when you're studying. It's probably not going to be the case that every practice test is going to be better than the last one, and so there's going to be some emotional fallout if your score doesn't move or if your score goes down. That actually does happen, and I'll probably do a podcast in the future on how to handle score drops, but just in the meantime, just make sure you have something fun scheduled to reward yourself for taking a full practice test after the fact, because it's difficult to do. It takes about 4 hours, and it's super, super intense for your mind, and you want to make sure you have some really solid recovery time planned after the test. Even if you plan to review a little bit of it that day, make sure you have a really, really nice break, at least 2 or 3 hours after you take the practice test, to just come at it with a fresh perspective. Now, importantly, you want to make sure that you don't take practice exams when you're stressed out or tired. Like, don't take a practice test when you just got in a really difficult argument with someone you live with. Unless you've resolved it and it's all good. It's totally fine to wait on practice tests if you have to take them in stressful situations. So, for example, many of my students are sort of have a stressful week at work, but they've committed to taking a practice test, so they do it anyway. I think especially early in your prep, you don't want to do that. You instead want to either take it the next day, move your schedule around so you take it another day that week or that weekend. You definitely want to avoid taking practice tests on work days for the most part, because it's either going to tax you really heavily in the morning. That might affect your performance at work, or you're going to be tired at the end of the day, like I mentioned at the beginning of the lesson. But just make sure you're being wise about setting up your practice tests, and it's probably better to do slightly fewer practice tests, even if you have to bail out on one, that are taken very well and in an environment that's representative of how you would actually perform on the real test, than it is to just take a bunch of practice tests but have them not reflect your actual abilities, because your practice exams are going to be a very important source of data that you're going to use to figure out what and how you should be studying in between those tests, and you don't want to be giving yourself bad data points because the reason you missed a bunch of geometry questions is because you were tired or stressed or distracted, rather than you're not that good at geometry. You can waste a lot of study time if you're not getting accurate data from your practice exam. So feel free to push a practice exam to the next week if it's a much more stressful weekend than you thought it was going to be, and don't feel guilty about that. That's just making a smart decision. Now, there is an exception here. In the last few weeks before your exam, it's probably a good idea to take a full-length practice test a couple weekends heading into your exam for stamina purposes. And even if you're stressed or tired then, I would still recommend taking those tests just for practice and just admitting to yourself, okay, I'm a little stressed, I'm a little tired. This score is probably not going to be representative of my abilities. I'm not going to take this score as seriously as I normally would, but I'm still going to sit down and do this just to make sure that I'm in a good space for test day. Now, the other caveat I should mention there is I don't recommend taking practice tests in close succession leading up to your exam. Like, I don't think it's a good idea to take 5 practice tests the 5 days leading up to your exam, even though that does work for some people. I don't make it as a general recommendation. I definitely don't recommend taking practice exams the day before your exam, but I think if you have 1 or 2 days of buffer space, it's okay to take a practice exam on a Saturday and then take the real GMAT on a Tuesday. You just want to prioritize rest on that Sunday and Monday that are between your last practice test and your official exam. Let's talk about managing distractions. honestly, the best way to manage day-to-day distractions is just getting enough downtime. I think that's the key, because the more stressed you are and the more tired you are, the more distractible you are. The easier it is to just open up that social media feed and burn 30 minutes without realizing it, and then all of a sudden your study time is cut in half for the day. So while you're studying, managing the phone, I think, is very important. So putting in an airplane mode, or at the very least, do not disturb while you're studying. And then if you do get texts and emails while you're studying, if there's any possible way that you can just wait to reply to those until you're done with the current topic, done with your study session, or just ready to take a study break, that will greatly enhance the productivity of your study. I already mentioned picking a location where you can focus, but just think about that. Some people like home, some people like the office. Find a place where you can get into a good groove that supports you being focused. Now, last but definitely not least, please have a study plan so that when you do sit down to study, you have a very clear idea of what you're supposed to be working on next. Now, if you're very much at a loss for this, check out the very first episode of this podcast, where I go into depth about some recommendations for what I think are good study providers and how you want to manage that depending on your budget and your time frame. But please don't just wing it. Please don't just sit down and say, okay, I'm going to study for an hour, and then just get online and start doing some problems randomly. You want to make sure you have a plan that's structured based around your goals and your needs. And if you have to, just find a free plan online. You can go on r/GMAT on Reddit. You can Google free plans. You can ask people for study plans, and people are very willing to provide that kind of thing, often for free. But my strongest recommendation would be engage with a professional. Take a class, get a tutor, find a way to structure your studies with someone who has a lot of success in the industry. And if you're interested in my perspective, then you can head to my website, GMATstrategy.com, and you can check out my class, which is basically no risk to try. I'll give you your money back if you don't like it within the first few days that you have it, first 30 days actually. And I include a study plan that you can use just some books to get by on. And that tends to be a very good low-cost option for people who are really at a loss. But my guess is you can probably find some good plans, and if you're taking a class or doing private tutoring, they're going to set you up with a realistic study plan, and you should stick to that as much as you possibly can and trust their recommendations. Now, if you really can't find something, feel free to reach out to me, but please don't abuse that and use that as an excuse to be lazy and not search for your own plan beforehand. But if you've searched and you've looked around and you're really not finding something satisfactory, or you want my personal opinion on certain study plans, feel free to reach out to me. Definitely reach out if you have questions, okay? I'm at the GMAT Strategy on Instagram, on Facebook, on Reddit, and on YouTube. Now, as always, my greatest hope is that this information will make your studies as easy and as painless as they possibly can be. If you want more tips and strategies for optimizing your performance on the GMAT, just head to GMATstrategy.com and check out my video presentation on how to achieve your dream GMAT score in half the normal time and with half the normal effort. In the meantime, this is a weekly show, so please subscribe and stay positive and stay consistent with your studies. If you have feedback on this episode, I know the last couple weeks I've been going into the more kind of mental game, sort of less test-specific, tactical kind of stuff. I've tried to make it as tactical as I can, but I'm very open to your feedback on whether this is helpful for you or not. So feel free to reach out and let me know what direction you would like the podcast to go in the future. I'll talk to you soon.